This might be the craziest graph in biology. For billions of years, life stayed small, like bacteria. And then 500 million years ago, we had the Cambrian Explosion, which created all of this big life, plants and fungi and animals. And even after 5 mass extinctions, we got mammals and then us Homo sapiens. So today we're going to tell the story of this chart. And this chart has 4 big puzzles in it. But what about this third puzzle? How did we get today's biosphere? We're not just a bunch of little Cambrian explosion trilobites in water. We got this with an explosion into complex ecologies of sea, land, and air. In other words, there wasn't just a Cambrian explosion into the sea, but later there was one onto the land and finally one into the air. So here's the graph that shows these evolutionary radiations during the Phanerozoic. The first one, the explosion into the water, was the Cambrian explosion. Then we had the explosion onto land, this terrestrial revolution. And then finally, after the Great Dying, and then at the end of the dinosaurs, we had this Cretaceous terrestrial revolution of flowers and insects into the air on land. So let's look at these explosions into water and then land and then air. And as a reminder, in between each of those explosions, there's these mass extinctions. So you had that explosion into water and then boom, a big mass extinction. You had some of these explosions onto land and then a mass extinction. You had this massive Great Dying at the end of the Permian. You had, midway through the reptiles, the dinosaurs, there was this extinction. And then finally you had the big asteroid event as well, which allows to transition from reptiles to mammals. Okay, so let's start with this Cambrian explosion into the water. And I actually want to start with this really kind of cute picture of some of these simple creatures that we started with, where, we had these choanoflagellates. They're these like pseudo multicellular creatures that are starting to try to be multicellular together. And then we got stuff like these comb jellies, Ctenophora, which are these really weird kind of phyla that we don't talk about too much, very old. We also got the sponges, these little sponges, Porifera, and we got these Placozoa, which is really amazing. There's only 2 of these species left. They're like the first way to be like, what if I am just a mat on the ground? They're really dumb, and they just have some cilia to move around in. Kind of cute. And then we got cnidarians, the jellyfish. And then we also got bilaterians, which everything else got created after that, the lobsters, the fish, and everything in between. And so we're shifting, what this is a little bit showing is that we're shifting from the cilia movement, moving with your little flagella kind of, to muscles. And this is a graph that shows some of these marine families over time. You can see here's the Cambrian and Ordovician, and you can see some of these species that existed way back then. They started, these families, and then they kind of died out. And then later we had the Paleozoic, a bunch more species, and then a lot of them died out. And then finally we have these modern species. And so here's this kind of explosion during the Cambrian, but especially during the Ordovician. Look at how many creatures expanded during the Ordovician. Here's a graph that shows the kind of types of fauna that we're talking about. So these Cambrian fauna are these weird kind of acid trip creatures, where you have trilobites, but then you also have some of these weird, strange creatures with like 5 eyes that are kind of coming out of their brain. Those are extinct. And then during the Ordovician, we have, Paleozoic fauna. So these are ones that we know a little bit more about. And so these are things like starfish, but also a lot of stuff that didn't survive later on. So these are like brachiopods and bryozoa and weird little creatures. And then finally, after the Great Dying, after that massive extinction, then you have the modern fauna that we know today with modern mollusks and crabs and then all the vertebrates. So you can partially think of these early creatures as some of these shelly creatures, like these shelly creatures. And you can also think of them though as, people will sometimes talk about this as the age of fishes. And we got our first fishes during the Devonian, some of these jawless fishes, these are lampreys, these placoderms, these big kind of armored fish that went extinct. These are sharks, cartilaginous fishes. And then finally we get these bony fishes, which much later turn into all the fish that we know today. And then finally, of course, this does show that we are all fish. We evolved from a lobe-finned fish, and we'll talk about these creatures when we talk about the explosion onto land. So here's an image that shows what the sea looked like during the Ordovician, right before fish, where you have all these really cool things where you have, look at these little crinoids. They're these little creatures that used to exist on the ground. They mostly don't exist these days. Here's this little trilobite on the ground. These branching structures, these bryozoans, these little filter feeding animals that live in colonies. You had some of these early little cephalopod-like creatures. Here's another image that shows some of these early creatures. They're these little crinoids. We have those brachiopods, which are essentially like a clam, but they're a bivalve, but they're slightly different. These ammonites are kind of like nautilus and things like that. And I don't know why this image it says poop petrified up here. I didn't see that when I first printed it out, but you get a feeling of what some of these early creatures were like during the Paleozoic. And then we got some of these, the age of fishes, where you had these massive placoderms, these armored fishes with their heads had armor on them, were all bony. Then you have these big water scorpions, which are crazy. And so around this time, the biomass distribution on Earth was different. So you can see here's the biomass distribution of Earth today, where you have, it's mostly plants, a good amount of bacteria, and then within animals, but overall there were a lot less fish. And so you can see that with this kind of estimate for Paleozoic biomass, where yes, we had there were still a lot of arthropods in the water, but chordata, those things like fish, yes, there were some fish, but we didn't have the mass fish that we have today. And back then we had a lot of these earlier creatures, these brachiopods that we barely even have today, and things like echinoderms, like starfish, that barely even show up on the other graph. A lot of these Paleozoic fauna, by the way, they became extinct when these modern fauna came around, especially during this Mesozoic marine revolution, where you had all these reptiles in the water with jaws that could crunch through the shells, and so that killed a lot of these earlier species. Okay, so we had this explosion into the water, but then we also got this explosion onto land. We call this the Silurian-Devonian terrestrial revolution. And as a reminder, both the explosion onto land and into water is gated by the amount of sediment and phosphorus that creatures can access. So you can see here's a graph that shows in red how much net sediment flux to the ocean, and that essentially maps onto the number of marine families. And so yes, a lot of other things are going on, but mostly it's just a function of how much sediment's going into the water. And now that we're going on to land, the same thing is true, where you can see how much total area is covered by sediment. So this is water that's not, and sediment that's not going into the ocean, but is rather going onto these lakes and things onto land. Then when these plants get to show up. And so you can see again, they're very connected with each other. The number of plant species is very connected to the amount of area covered by sediment. Okay, so here's this explosion onto land, and it happened with plants first, where you can see, here's all of these, we have these algae, and then there are really kind of 5 phyla of plants, just like there are kind of 9 phyla for animals. The 5 phyla for plants are algae, and then we have mosses, ferns, these cone-bearing plants, aka gymnosperms like conifers, and then finally flowering plants, aka angiosperms. And over time, we initially had these algae in the water, these mosses kind of came onto land, but they still need to reproduce in the water. And then we got ferns with their vascular tissue, with their veins and arteries, and then also their spores. And then we got seeds instead of spores, so that these cone-bearing plants could reproduce more easily on land. And finally, we got these angiosperms, which are plants that have fruit, or they also have nectar. And so they are kind of optimized for this world. And so we're going to talk a lot about these now, while later we're going to talk about these flowering plants, because they're connected to the explosion into the air, not just onto land. Here's another way to view that graph, but kind of over time. The x-axis is kind of weird here, but you can see 500 million years ago, we started to have some of these mosses onto land. These vascular plants came on 400 million years ago, and then seed plants 300 million years ago, and then much, much, much later, 150 million years ago, we get the flowering plants. Here's a graph that shows all these, mosses and then ferns coming onto land, and then we get much later, we get the gymnosperms, like the conifers, and then finally much, much later, we get the angiosperms. And in order to come onto land, plants needed to have a bunch of special things because they were built for the water. And so what they needed to do is they need to essentially bring the water with them onto the land, both for their own bodies, but also for their reproduction. And so you can see there are these things called cuticles. That's kind of like their skin. And so you can see the cuticle coats leaves and stems, preventing water loss. And then meanwhile, the vascular tissue transports water and nutrients, while lignin and xylem walls supports the plant. And so the idea here is just like we have veins and arteries that need to keep the blood flowing, plants have veins and arteries too. And then finally, you have the roots that need to get into the ground and absorb water and minerals to anchor the plant. So all of these things, and even these leaves to capture sunlight, and the stomata to do gas exchange, all of these things needed to become evolved for these little plants as they were being like, okay, I've been in the water as algae, but I want to come up onto land as a little moss, as a little fern. I need to be able to stay wet on land, and I need to be able to grow big on land, and to have these systems that allow me to grow tall and that allow me to move my nutrients through my body. And then reproduction, they need to do the same thing, because remember at the beginning, they could only reproduce in water. And so finally, when they got onto land, they said, oh, okay, we're gonna have pollen, as a fern, I'm gonna have pollen, I'm just gonna kind of shoot my shot. I'm gonna kind of spray and pray and hope it lands to someone. but then that thing still needs to reproduce in water. Well, and then the seeds were crazier because what they did is they contained an embryo and its food supply. So you didn't need to go back to water in order to reproduce. And then again, much later, we got the flowers and fruits, which I'll talk about in the third section. This obviously massively increased plant biomass, where you get the Devonian and the Carboniferous, which is where all of our fossil fuels are from. And then later, even more and more plant biomass today, up to 1,000 gigatons. To really hit this home, look at how crazy this is. Back in the day, none of the land was covered by plants, obviously. And now it went up to 50% during the Carboniferous, and now it's like 80% of the land is covered by plants. There's some deserts and there's some ice, but the rest of it has been totally colonized by plants. After the plants came onto land, we got a little bit more shade, we got some more oxygen, the ozone layer got a little bit better, and some of these little fish, some of these little lobe-finned fish, they started to swim their way onto the land. They started to be a little tiktaalik, and they're like, ooh, what if I kind of hang out up here? And then eventually they turned from fish into these amphibians. Amphibians, though, are only built for that boundary area, right? They can go onto land, but they kind of love water. And so, amphibians, they live on land and in water. They lay eggs, they have moist skin, they have webbed feet. And so they're not built for the land. But reptiles, they have scales, they have dry skin. They lay these eggs. They're called amniotes. They have this amniotic fluid, this egg that they lay. And so this is an amazing shift from amphibians to reptiles. And the interesting thing here is how similar this is to the plants. The plants need to have a skin layer, those cuticles, so that they didn't lose water. And that's essentially what reptiles are. That's what we are. We're fish that are now on land, and we have this skin, this dry skin, what's called keratinized skin, where little keratin, it's around our skin, it's on our nails and stuff too, but it was first onto our skin. We're 70% water, and we don't just want to lose that water, but we're kind of fish now have to be in these water sacs on land. And the other thing is with our eggs, just like how amphibians, lay their eggs, a lot of stuff is in water, the tadpoles are in the water. For early plants, they had to reproduce with water, but then reptiles say, no, we're gonna make an egg. That egg's gonna be this weird little water sac, and that's where our creatures are gonna be born. And that's called an amniote. And the hardest part of this transition was probably not lungs. Fish were doing lungs already. It was always helpful for them to kind of come up and get air from the surface. The hardest thing was making sure you didn't lose all that water, and so you had to create eggs and also dry skin to make it so you don't lose the water. And so during the Silurian-Devonian terrestrial revolution, we had plants and then animals come onto land. It was really crazy. During the Carboniferous, that's when there was so much oxygen around us, 30% oxygen. We had these dragonflies that were just massive dragonflies flying around. And so the Silurian was interesting because some of these kind of tetrapods, these four-limbed creatures, were on land, and they were like, what should we be? And we know that they eventually became reptiles during the dinosaurs, and then later became mammals. But the question is, what were they going to be now during the Paleozoic? And actually around this time, the kind of proto-tetrapods that existed were called synapsids. They were these kind of proto-mammal creatures that kind of branched off from the main reptiles and eventually turned into mammals. And so what happened around this time was we got the Great Dying. It was this massive extinction. We had a ton of CO2 into the world, and so everything died. And then we got the reptiles after that. But you can imagine a different reality where we actually got these proto-mammals kind of won earlier instead of the reptiles winning. So we have this massive extinction here. And then as a reminder, some of these reptiles, they went onto land, but then they went back into the water. And so that's when this crazy Mesozoic marine revolution happened. And that's when we had essentially dinosaurs in the water, which would be terrifying. And so here's us. And so then you have all these massive marine reptiles coming back into the water with their big jaws. And that's when they caused a bunch of other, species extinctions, because they came back in and they said, hey, look, you can't just be a shelly creature anymore. You have to be really hard to pry off the rocks. You have to be very spiky, or you have to go down into the water in order to get away from us. And then finally, we had obviously the big asteroid extinction, and around that time we had what's called this Cretaceous terrestrial revolution. And I like to think of this as an explosion into the air. So this is flowering plants and also insects. So when we think about the world today, especially in terms of vertebrates, it's kind of this graph where you see, in the Mesozoic, there weren't that many birds or mammals, but then boom, we had that massive asteroid event. And after that, we got a bunch more fish in the water. We had, a big reptile extinction, but then part of our birds, the birds kind of broke away from reptiles. And they said, hey, I'm going to be a little dinosaur with feathery wings. And then finally, we also got mammals. And so that's why sometimes people talk about the Cenozoic as the age of birds or mammals, or they talk about as the age of social insects and flowers. And so that other chart made birds and mammals look big, but they're tiny compared to the rest of the animal kingdom. And so you can see here that here's all these insects that got really big at this time. These are the Hypomentra. These are the kind of the weird social insects like, bees and wasps. We got Coleoptera, which are the beetles. I think it's something like 25% of all species, all animal species are beetles. We got the butterflies, and then we also have the flies. And of course we have arachnids and spiders. And so all of these creatures, all these insects, they co-evolved with these angiosperms. And I think it's something like 90% of plant biomass today are these angiosperms, these flowering plants. And angiosperms did kind of two main things. The first is, in terms of reproduction, they made flowers that produce pollen and egg cells, and they also have these fruits to protect and disperse their seeds. And so what that means is, instead of the fern style where you spray and pray your pollen, instead you get these insects, you attract them to you, you say, come to me, and then they take that pollen and then go over and put it into a different plant, and that produces egg and sperm together, and boom, you get a zygote. And then once you have that zygote, once you have a little embryo, then you put a bunch of fruit around it, and then you say, hey, instead of just going directly underneath me where mom and child are gonna have to compete over area, instead you say, hey, come and get me, little creature, and a little primate picks you up, eats you, poops you out. And so what you get is you go further away from your parents, and you have a bunch of poop around you so that you're ready to be a new plant. The other thing that these angiosperms did is they increased their vein density. So you can kind of see this image here where if you look at a plant like a conifer, it doesn't have many veins in it. But if you look at a leaf of like a broadleaf forest or even like a grass or whatever, it has so much vein density. And then it also has a bunch of stomatal density. So these are the openings. And so it has so many more openings and so many more veins, and so it can get so much more energy. And so that's why you can see here, the angiosperms are 90% of species, while conifers and ferns and everything else is less than 10%. Here are two graphs that kind of show that. This first one shows, all of the different forests on Earth. And the forests that are conifers, that are these, gymnosperms, are these boreal forests up here up north. But then the rest of the forest, all the tropical, temperate, subtropical, the Amazon and the Democratic Republic of Congo and the forests of Southeast Asia, all of these forests are angiosperms. Plus, all of the grasslands are these angiosperms too. And so you can see here's these natural grasslands like in the American West or in the grasslands of Asia with the Mongols, or you can kind of see the grasslands of Kenya, or you can see these cultivated grasslands, the Amazon or corn up here. And all of these grasses are also angiosperms. So when I say flowering plants, I don't just mean kind of cute roses or dandelions or whatever. I mean all the grasses, aka all the food for everybody on Earth, and all the forests, aka all of the rainforests and ecosystems on Earth. The final crazy impact that these angiosperm dominated ecosystems had is they created these grassland biomes. They had probably more kind of sedimentation and stuff going into the waters. And what that meant is we got these pelagic food webs. What is this thing? Well, these pelagic calcifiers, you can see their kind of rise in the last kind of 100 million years or so. And what these are these little plankton that exist in the water. And so what these creatures are, they are some of these protists, these single-celled creatures that are still eukaryotes. For most of this time, we've been talking about this side of the graph, these, animals and fungi and some of these green plants. But remember that so much of the actual biodiversity here is in these tiny little creatures. Some of these amoebozoa, but also some of these, what's called SAR, straminopiles, alveolates, and rosaria. And these are these little creatures that are actually really important. So here are these little microbes. You can see some of them, this one called foraminifera. This is one of these pelagic calcifiers that we were talking about before. You can see planktonic foraminifera here. What these are is they are a little creature that has a calcium shell. So it's kind of like a mollusk, but a little single-celled mollusk. And they're actually responsible for, if you think about all the concrete in the world, if you think about how the pyramids were built, a lot of that comes from these tiny little foraminifera. And so you have the rise of these calcifiers, and pelagic here, pelagic means that they're in the deep water. So it's not just like, corals and mollusks and stuff, they'll sometimes calcify, but they're doing it in a benthic ecosystem, which is kind of like a shallow water. While these ones, the foraminifera, they do it in the deep water. And so you're getting all these planktonic creatures out there that are doing tons and tons of our photosynthesis, they also start to create these food webs. And so you can see those here where you have these dinoflagellates and these diatoms. And what they are, the diatoms are they're called the jewels of the sea. They're these little silicate creatures. They're kind of like foraminifera, but they are made, instead of having a calcified edge, they have a silicon edge. So they're kind of made of sand. And then the dinoflagellates are the things that kind of eat these two creatures. And so what you get is that you have these angiosperm-dominated ecosystems that push more stuff into the water, that allow these pelagic food webs and pelagic calcifiers to exist with these tiny little protists. And the crazy thing that these things do is they are calcifying organisms that are not based on being near the coral reef and stuff like that. And so what it means is when there's tons of CO2 that's pushed into the world, these creatures act as kind of like a sink for it, because what they do is they take that CO2, pull it into them, and turn it into calcium carbonate to make their shells. And so they are essentially an extinction buffer. And so back in the day, we had a bunch of marine extinctions, but now we don't because we have this big kind of CO2 buffer. So you can see here's a graph over time of these different, the circles are the big impact craters. So this is the big crater, 60 million years ago that killed all the dinosaurs, Chicxulub. And then something like Siberian traps, these are these big, large igneous provinces. That's essentially, a big place in Russia where all this CO2 kind of got pushed out into the world. And so you can see over time in the last, 100 million or so years, there still have been some of these big, large igneous provinces and stuff. But the ones here, the Deccan, those have not produced the same marine extinctions as we had during the Siberian traps. And part of that is that they're a little bit less big, but a lot of that is that we have these pelagic calcifiers that act as a sink, turning CO2 into calcium carbonate and then using that as in their bodies and then falling down to the bottom of the ocean, acting as a sink for carbon, which then means that the rest of the oceans don't get as hurt by a rising acidity of that CO2 level. So this is all to say that, we had an explosion into water, onto land, and then finally into the air. And when you ask, how did we get to today's biosphere? Well, we got it by these explosions into these complex ecologies of sea, land, and air. Thank you, as always, for watching, and thank you to Roots donors for supporting this channel. If you want to understand more about the past and how we got here, check out the previous videos here. And if you want to understand the future and where we're going, feel free to subscribe here. Hope to see you then. Bye.